Welcome to Small Arm Solutions. Today we have sort of a, I'm sure it's been an anticipated video for quite some time. Probably four or 5 years ago, I wrote a white paper on the US M855A1 ammunition. The ammunition I had access to at that time was some of the earliest production ammunition. We did a pretty thorough review on it. And again, over the years, there's been changes in the ammunition and more information's come out. But for the most part, most of the technical data on the M855A1 is still classified. It's still basically a secret. The Army doesn't leave any of it out. However, those of us who get our hands on this ammunition are able to do some forms of testing. And I've had some pretty strong opinions of the M855A1 from day one. We got some additional information here so we can start putting some more of the pieces together that are more apples to apples in comparison. It's more understanding of how the M855 Alpha 1 works. But let's talk a little bit about why it came along. If you look at the evolution of the 5.56 millimeter cartridge, we started off with the M193 ball. Now, this was a 5.56, but it was not 5.56 NATO. There was no NATO standardization for it. It wasn't until the M855 came out, which was the Belgian SS-109, that became the 5.56 NATO. The 5.56 NATO is a three-piece projectile with a copper jacket, lead plug, and a steel penetrator core. So when we talk about 5.56 NATO, that is the NATO cartridge. Now we're going to start to look into the M855A1. The M855A1 is not a NATO cartridge. It's a totally different everything. It has different everything, a different projectile, different propellant, different port pressures, different chamber pressures. It's like a completely different animal. And then we have a black tip over here, which is called the M995AP, or armor piercing round. And we'll talk a little bit about this round as well. But let's start talking about the M855 Alpha 1. Now, initially, the projectile was made of three pieces as well. You had basically a copper outer, you had a tin bismuth plug, then you had this wrapped around spear-pointed penetrator core of hardened steel. It was a green projectile. The government wanted to go green. They wanted to get rid of lead for lead poisoning and lead, just all kinds of environmental issues. For some reason, they decided this was the direction they wanted to go. So the first round we see here, which has more of a brownish colored tip to it, it's the same type of a projectile, but instead of using lead, they used tin and bismuth. So they had found with the tin bismuth, when it would be fired in Arctic environments, that it would have problems stabilizing because of the weight was not proper. Your weight is very different between this of the solid projectile versus the lead projectile, the 62 grain, and we're going to get into that when we start talking about barrel wear. So the Alpha 1 had gone over from the XM855A1 to the M855A1 we see over here, which is the current production one. To get around the issue they had with the stability in Arctic, they went with a copper plug. So basically you had a projectile that was made of all copper, and then that was wrapped around the steel core, which is actually not really a core, it's the entire front of the bullet. It was interesting when these first came out, some of them you could actually spin the core in the bullet. There was actually a PM that came out from the Army which said that that's okay when that happens, that's what it's designed to do. But there were some very negative aspects of this cartridge. So your projectile, when it would hit the gas port, it would have its peak pressure right there so it would operate properly. The problem is when you put that in a carbine, because the way that peak works, you get a much higher cyclic rate in a short gas system with a 14.5-inch barrel. When they developed the M855A1, they wanted to have the same pressures basically to get the same velocities you would out of a 20-inch barrel out of a 14.5-inch barrel. So basically this was part of what increased the pressures with the new propellant. However, once the ammunition was tested, it was found to have some serious issues, and that was around its port pressures. Now, initially, we were looking at port pressures that basically were comparing 20-inch barrels. The data was a little confusing because of the temperature. You're comparing one that was 75 degrees to one that was 125 degrees. Of course, when you increase the heat on a projectile or on a cartridge, that increases the chemical reaction and gives you a higher pressure. So we're going to start going a little more apples to apples here. When you're looking at port pressures and chamber pressures on an M855, you were looking at about 51,000 psi, 51,522 to be exact on what we tested. The port pressures on the M855A1 were 59,102. There's a couple reasons for that. One was to boost up the the projectile's speed to give you the proper port pressures in that carbine length gas system instead of the rifle, which also means when you're using a 20-inch barrel, you're going to get increased velocities even over that of the M855, which we did do some testing on. The problem is barrel wear because of this projectile. When you boost up with that pressure being boosted up, there's also an issue with causing higher pressures with the bullet going down the bore. The way this copper projectile is, it doesn't crush the same way in a barrel and form that a lead bullet does. When it has a copper core with a jacket with a lead core, that will crush down relatively easy to give it the velocity. That doesn't happen with this one. This one here, it's much harder and it requires much more pressure to push it down the barrel. That's what also causing you a half barrel life versus M855A1 versus a gun firing M855. Just due to the way that projectile goes down the barrel, the way that it doesn't crush down as easy, it has much more wear on that barrel. We're increasing our pressures up to 9,000 PSI. We start looking at 59 to 60,000 PSI versus 52,000. You're really boosting those pressures up. A proof cartridge is 70,000 PSI. So once you start getting a hotter cartridge, you can be well up into that 63,000 PSI in the M4 carbine. So you're increasing that. So what are we doing here? By increasing your port pressure, you're increasing your chamber pressure, you're also increasing your cyclic rate. So you're basically getting the guns running faster, which means you're going to break bolts at a much higher interval, and the gun's going to wear a lot quicker, which is we've seen. Another issue that we've seen with the M855 Alpha 1 is the damaging of the barrel extension as well as the upper receiver, because you have this steel penetrator core, which is harder than that of the barrel extension. When using the original magazines, the feed would not be proper, so the actual nose of that bullet would strike the barrel extension, and that would cause severe damage, which you're going to see from a photograph. So there was a way that was dealt with was a new magazine, the Brown EPM magazine, or Enhanced Performance magazine. It's identified by a brown body with a blue follower. What that does is it raises the tip. So the tip of the M855 Alpha 1 will clear the barrel extension rather than hit it. The other magazine that was adopted for this same purpose by the Marine Corps was the Magpul Gen 3. The Magpul Gen 3 does the same thing. And I also want to give you a little bit of information about the use of the M27 with the M855 Alpha 1. As many of you may or may not know, the M27 has an extremely high cyclic rate compared to an M4. That's part of its operability. It's also why the parts on the M27 wear out at a much quicker interval. Now we're going to introduce the M855 Alpha 1 that has an additional 9,000 to 10,000 PSI, which is going to make that gun run even faster. There's issues with that gun magazine being able to keep up that shot column with that higher cyclic rate of that M27. Reliability problems using standard magazines. So instead of the Marine Corps going with the EPM magazine, they went with the Brown PMag. The Brown PMag does the exact same thing for as far as the EPM Enhanced Performance magazine, but it does it better. Because of the fact you have that high cyclic rate, by the Magpul PMag having proper alignment, you're having a polymer magazine body, a magazine follower, and you're having a stronger magazine spring. You have far less friction on that follower moving upward, so it works much better with higher cyclic rates and rising that shot column up faster. So it's a combination of getting that shot column to move up faster and having it on a proper alignment to get it to work with the M27 IAR. So the Marine Corps have had issues with this. This is how they've chosen to fix it. Again, it's a compatibility problem. The other problem we had with the Alpha 1 is it's not NATO standard. There is no NATO rifle out there other than our rifles with the proper magazines that can shoot this stuff. So we have interchangeability problem now because we're no longer using the 5.56 NATO cartridge for our allies. So overall, we did some testing. Now the testing that we showed, it doesn't show as much as the increase in velocities. This was due because they had to bring that initial charge down so it'd work with these firearms. So let's talk about some of the data that we had. We started with the M193 ball, and we had an M16A4 20-inch barrel, which we had 3,178 feet per second with a port pressure of 15,000 psi and a chamber pressure of 52,000 psi. So that would be normal for an M193. M4, we had a muzzle velocity of 2,975 feet per second. Again, M193, 55 grain full metal jacket. The next round we shot was the M855 ball, the standard issue green tip, Lake City, made in 2014. First weapon was an M16A4 20-inch barrel with a muzzle velocity of 3,124 feet per second. We had a port pressure of 17,852 feet per second, which is a little bit higher than that of the M193 at 15,000 psi. A chamber pressure of 51,522 foot-pounds of energy. Okay, so basically we're looking at 51 versus 52. The chamber pressure was slightly higher on the M193. Again, 73 degrees. Now, we did have another round, but I only had 2 of them, so I couldn't fire them, and that was the actual prototype XM855 LC. It was Lake City made in 2010. Unfortunately, that one I only had 2 of, and I was not about to fire those. This is the one that I would have expected to see a much higher port pressure than one that we have now. So the next one was M855 Alpha 1 Lake City made in 2012. M16A4 20-inch barrel, 3,171 feet per second. So basically you're getting the same velocity with a 62 grain bullet that you did with a 55 grain bullet in that same barrel. With a port pressure of 16,752 psi. Okay, now you're comparing that to the M85, you were slightly lower. Chamber pressure, however, is where things got really, really whacked out. Chamber pressure on the M855 Alpha 1 was 59,102. And the chamber pressure on the M855 was 51,522. Both of these were same conditions, 73 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're seeing over nearly a 9,000 psi chamber change in pressure in a 20-inch barrel. So now we put that same round in a 14.5-inch barrel at 2,911 feet a second. So again, you're getting roughly the same PSI out of a 62 grain bullet as you are out of the 55 grain projectile. So now let's look at some current production. We want to thank Dozer Munitions for providing us some of these rounds so we can do some testing on them. M855 Alpha 1 LC23 current production. Current production, M16A4 20-inch barrel, 3,172 feet per second. Basically identical to that of a 55 grain projectile out of the same length barrel. The M4 14.5-inch barrel, 2,908 feet per second. So you're looking at slightly higher on the M4 with the M855. But again, we start talking about the propellants. The propellants are a totally different blend to be used. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The propellant is stabilized as St. Mark's SMP842 with the addition of a reduced muzzle flash and for copper fouling in the bore. It uses standard M855 primers, but it uses a stab crimp instead of the roll crimp. Instead of using a roll crimp, you have stakes that go in there. And the reason for that stakes was because you have this higher PSI, that would keep the primer from being popped out during firing. So that was one of the changes that were made. So that was, again, to withstand the higher chamber pressures. Now, also contains several additives, a temperature stabilizer to minimize effects of heat and cold burning rates. Because again, when you have 73 degrees, you have one velocity. 125 degrees, you're going to have a much higher port pressure and chamber pressure. Then when you go to the cold weather, everything is a little bit on the lower side. So you got to make sure you stay within the operating pressures of that weapon in hot and cold, and then of course in temperate. Along with the additive to deal with the burning rates, there's also a decoppering agent, which was used to mitigate the effects of the jacket fouling from the new projectile. Because again, this is a whole new different material that's used in the projectile. There's another additive to reduce muzzle flash, which is helpful with the new cartridge from a fired to short barrel. Basically, you have a propellant that burns. If while it's burning, you have a shorter barrel, when the bullet exits into the atmosphere, you're going to see a big flash of that unburnt propellant. The more powder that's burned in the barrel, the less you're going to get once the bullet leaves the muzzle. So there's the additive. That's pretty much standard in most military ammunition. You have flash inhibitors that's in there. Now again, the muzzle velocity was boosted to improve lethality and range with a shorter M4 carbine because again, we've gotten rid of the M16A2 and A4s in the 20-inch barrels and gone to the 14.5-inch barrels, and that's what this thing was designed for, designed around to get the same kind of performance as the 20-inch barrel. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that the M855A1 was supposed to be. It was supposed to have increased penetration. We did do some testing on a half-inch of hard steel plate. We basically tried with the M193, the M855, the M855 Alpha 1, and the M995AP. Well, as you're going to see from the photograph, the M193 makes it look like a pop pimple. It hardly did any damage to it whatsoever. Look at the M855, they put a very, very, very slight crater in. Then when you look at the damage from the M855 Alpha 1, it bore through a little bit, maybe quarter to halfway through the hardened steel plate. However, the M995, which is a true AP, blew through it like it was nothing. So when you take a look at the penetrations on this piece of hard steel, you can definitely see there's a big increase in penetration between the M855 and the M855 Alpha 1. But again, on that piece of armor, the only one that would go through it is the M995 AP round, which is a tungsten carbide projectile that comes to a sharp point, and it does a very good job on that. So we definitely won't argue the fact that it does do a better job on penetration. For as far as terminal performance is concerned, well, looking at the data for the terminal performance, we don't really see as much of a difference as the Army likes to say that it does. The biggest difference between the M85 and the Alpha 1 is the cavitation and the fact that the M855 breaks into several components. Generally, it fractures at the cantilever. You have multiple fragments that make multiple wound channels. And, of course, you have the steel penetrator core as well. The way that you generally stop a target is you destroy tissue. The more tissue that you destroy, the more apt you are to stop the target. The Alpha 1, it does very good on the cavitation, as you're going to see. But for as far as when it breaks apart, it doesn't break up into as many of those parts, so you don't get as much of that damage. So when you compare the two back to front, I would not say that there is a significant increase in terminal performance of the M855 Alpha 1. In fact, I probably would give a little bit more of an edge to the 855 over the Alpha 1. But hopefully the performance with the Alpha 1 is better than the M855. The M855, from lot to lot to lot, it went from decent to poor in the way that it would do its terminal performance. So the Alpha 1 is more consistent, but I think it's far more better for barrier. The next issue comes right down to accuracy. Now, the testing that we done did not see any significant increases in accuracy between the Alpha 1 and the standard M855. They do not zero the same. If you had a rifle that you zeroed with M855 and then you threw M855 Alpha 1, you were going to have to re-zero. That was one of the claims that the Army had that was not true. You do have to re-zero it. For as far as overall accuracy, I don't think there's that much of a difference. It's by no means match accurate, even though the Army has come out and said that it is. They've shot excellent groups with them. Shooting them out of a standard M4 carbine, I really didn't see that much of a difference. So what does all this boil down to? What we know now, and the data that I have now, it's a little bit better, apples to apples. You're seeing an increase of 9,000 PSI between it. Now, you have to understand where that PSI is coming from. You're not necessarily seeing it in velocity as much as you're seeing it in chamber and pore pressures, what it's required to push that bullet down that barrel, because it's a much harder bullet. And that's, again, what causes all that damage to that barrel over all time. There's conditions to make this ammo work properly. You have to have the proper magazine. You start using it in regular green magazines, follower magazines, you're going to have problems, just like with the pictures that you saw. For as far as it being that much of an improvement, again, the green thing is one thing, but you also have to look at the weapon too. You're decreasing the longevity of your weapon by at least half by using this new round. So you look at the cost of having to replace those parts versus the cost of this ammunition. This ammunition is obviously more expensive to manufacture than the Alpha 1. But overall, we do see that there is a difference in the chamber pressure and pore pressure is due to the propellant that's used and due to what's necessary to push that bullet down the bore. The velocities, you will see differences according to temperatures. The current ammunition does maintain the standard velocities of the M855, again, to keep these guns working as best as possible using this ammunition. When you really look at the whole way this whole program came around, a lot of money was dumped into this. And the fact that they knew before they adopted it that it was going to have a negative effect on the firearm. And it has. If you go back to the individual carbine program, all these finalists did very, very well. And then they were given, I don't know how many thousands of rounds of the Alpha 1. And every single one of those guys failed. This destroyed every one of the guns. The guys who were building the individual carbines, they were told to build around the regular M855. They had no idea it was going to be given the Alpha. And at that time, and still today, it's hard to get access as a manufacturer even to this ammunition to build a gun. Because, again, it's very different in its performance from the M855 and how it affects the performance of the gun. So they knew back then that this was going to destroy guns, and we've gone forward, and they've adopted it, getting a slight benefit in penetration, but you're still getting negative aspects of the gun. So the success of the overall program, I guess that's up to you to think. My perspective, this new round destroys the guns that it uses. It cuts the half-life, so you're not getting the overall benefits of it. It's an increased cost. And how much does it give you really over the Alpha 1? Again, it's green, so you're not using lead. But giving all the information we have, check it out for yourself. This ammunition is very, very rare. You can occasionally find it on Gunbroker and some places. It's rare. The M955AP is a round that probably should have been looked at for the next generation service weapon. They were talking about penetration. If you look at all the tests that were discussed for the NGSW program, it was always comparing it to Alpha 1 or M855. Well, try comparing that new cartridge to the M995. The M995 is a very expensive round. I forget what it was. It was like over $6 a round, if I recall, because of what's used in it. It has incredible terminal performance. It has incredible penetration. Why the penetration hasn't been looked at for as far as the Alpha 1, I don't know. Just as expensive. I can't imagine the Alpha 1 is that much cheaper than the 995. I'm sure it's some, but if penetration was really what you were looking at, that was a much better idea. But overall, I want to do a follow-up from the article. I know there's been a lot of people who've used that article, and they've referenced it a lot. A lot of people were talking about the information being outdated. Yes, it was in a ways, because you're looking at when that was written versus where we're at right now. There's been changes to that cartridge since that was written. That was very early on when this ammunition was first used. The first time I saw this ammunition was in Afghanistan. We heard about you heard about it through the news that this round was coming out. It wasn't until I got to Bagram and I actually saw this ammunition in people's rifles. So it was very, very new at that time. The original article that was done was up to date at that time. We also did get some better information comparing, because again, somebody noted that the one was noted 63,000 psi was 125 degrees versus the other one that was 73. So yeah, we got that. Then I was able to get the data for 73 degrees, so you can see that it was not like 9,000 psi difference versus 13,000 psi difference. So we did get some, so we can correct some of that information there. So overall, this is my opinion and my information on the M855 Alpha 1. It's been a long time coming, but sometimes it pays just to sit back and watch and see what happens before you just come out at once. So I hope you guys do enjoy this video. Please click like, please subscribe, even better share.